Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
When we started Teach First 10 years ago and looked at the education landscape, it seemed like the big gap in a lot of schools in low-income communities, in my mind, sums up one word, which is leadership. A lot of the children from our communities who come from low-income backgrounds need additional leadership in schools to succeed at the levels that they should and to achieve at the levels that they're capable of, to aspire to the things that they should be aspiring to, and to access the opportunities that they deserve to access. Beyond classroom leadership, there's the necessity of great school leadership, and you can see the great role that a head teacher, a wonderful head teacher, can play in leading a school. And then system leadership. We have Andrew here and many other system leaders who have created the system that will enable this change to happen. Over the last 10 years, I think where we've come at is the idea that the greatest social injustice in the UK currently is that some children just aren't getting the education they need to make the most of their own gifts. Children from lower income backgrounds just aren't achieving at the same level as children from higher income backgrounds. The gap in Britain, in England, continues to be one of the worst in the developed world. And though there's pockets of improvement, every year that goes by where every child doesn't get the education they need, that's one child who's lost that one opportunity in their life. It's our responsibility as the adults focused on this issue to change the situation. And what's exciting is we now have over 2,000 of our teachers and ambassadors, 2,000 ambassadors plus actually another 1,500 of our teachers. This year we're recruiting another 1,300 who I think are united by this belief, this mission, that it's up to them, it's up to their colleagues, it's up to all of society to change the situation as soon as possible. We just celebrated our 10th anniversary. We're now looking forward to the next 10 years, and we've come up with 5 impact goals around reducing the gap between low-income and high-income children in primary literacy and secondary test scores, in entrance into the 25% most selective university and graduation from these universities, entrance into the world of work, and in wider aspirations and well-being statistics. And with each of those, we think a lot of progress can be made in the next 10 years.
Brilliant. If there was one reform, one specific concrete reform that you could make now, if you were Prime Minister?
What our teachers often say is, look, can we just keep things stable for a few years, right? And when you talk to some of the systems like Canada and some of the others, when I've talked to some of the leaders in different systems, a lot of them say is, you know, you set a high goal, you put the system in place to achieve that goal, and then you just sort of let the profession know there's going to be a few years of stability where they work towards that goal. You know, and then slowly you start ratcheting up the goal year by year. And I think that sort of, you know, long-term perspective within the British system, I think that would be great if there was some sort of cross-party consensus around a long-term perspective of what schools should be working towards, how they should be working towards it, and then, you know, constantly over time ratcheting up the goals. That would probably be a good reform.
Thanks, Brett. Now, it's interesting, actually, that you end with continuity. Because when I worked with Andrew, my perception of Andrew was that he was, I think I once called you, Andrew, to another colleague, never to your face, but now's the chance. I called you a kind of centrist Trotskyite in the sense that your goals were centrist, but your kind of view of the world was continuous revolution.
I call myself a radical moderate, but it may be the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. But you kind of believed in continuous revolution in order to achieve goals which almost everyone would sign up to. So I'm kind of interested, the start-off point for you, and you've written a book calling for more radical change, is what do you think of I mean, say what you're going to say anyway, but it's an interesting starting point is Brett saying, well, actually what we need is consistency now.
Well, we obviously need consistency, but we need consistency around the right policies. I'm not in favour of some great education commission. We had something for decades called the Schools Council, which was supposed to bring the great and the good together to agree. It was lowest common denominator, and that was the period of 30 years when the state education system practically disintegrated. So the idea of consensus at any price, I don't buy. It's got to be consensus around policies for reform that radically improve opportunities and raise standards. Now, you need to work very hard to build consensus around those, and I'm all for that, and I've worked very hard around reforms to build consensus, but it can't be lowest common denominator consensus. It's got to be consensus around change and improvement. Now, I've always regarded education policy as essentially simple. The great socialist philosopher R.H. Tawney, what the wise parent would wish for their child so the state should wish for all children. That's been my guiding principle of education policy since I've been engaged in it. And my test of whether a school is good is very simple. Would I send my child to it? If the school is not good enough for me to send my own children to it, why should I, as a representative of the state, think it's good enough for other children to have to go to it? And my test when I was a Minister of Policy was very simple. Is this a policy I would wish to subject my own children to? Where it was a good policy, for example, I love the IB, and I wish I could have done it myself, and I think it's quite likely that my kids might want to do it. That's great, but I can tell you there's a whole raft of policies which were coming my way which I wouldn't have dreamt of wanting to subject my children to, and therefore I didn't go with those. Now, we come now to what is it that makes for a good education system. Again, that's quite simple. Strong and effective leadership, institution by institution. You need institutions that work as opposed to institutions that fail. Unfortunately, historically, a good proportion of our schools essentially failed. And they were very weak in terms of leadership and governance. Governance is a much underestimated but crucial aspect of a well-functioning education system. Every school needs high-capacity governance. One of the aspects of high-capacity governance is, of course, that those governors will need the freedom to get on with it. But simply allowing failing institutions to be cut free of the local bureaucracy is simply a recipe for reinforcing failure with failure. So the first requirement is high-capacity governance. The second key requirement is, of course, good teachers. No school can be better than its teachers. We now have in England today an average of 2 applicants per teacher training place. 2, if you take it across primary and secondary. It's lower in some secondary subjects. That's good, but it's still not nearly enough. Teaching is still, unfortunately, state school teaching is still barely a selective profession in this country. The best education systems in the world, Finland, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, the more go-ahead parts of China, you have 10 to 20 applicants per place. We've got to get to that level. Teach First, 7 applicants per place. A whole stream of applicants from top universities where, as I know when I was a tutor at Oxford a generation ago, almost no one was applying to go into state school teaching in more challenging schools. It's been a transformation and we need a great deal more of it. That's the second thing that's required. The third thing, we need to be quite upfront about this, is investment. As King Lear put it many moons ago, nothing will come of nothing. Unless we invest in our state education, which means in the infrastructure, better paying conditions for teachers, all of those things, you won't get a decent education system. It is no accident that those people who choose to go private pay twice as much for what they get as we pay in the state system. They're by and large quite discriminating purchasers of goods. We need to continue investing in the state education system. And the fourth requirement, of course, is a good system of curriculum and assessment. And we need to continually modernise our system of curriculum and assessment. And there's a huge reform agenda there as we raise the education participation age to 18 from 2015. But the single biggest requirement is to have a pathway through for the 50% who are not on track to go to university, which is worthwhile, gets decent qualifications for those young people, and gets them on a track through to good quality jobs with training, which I think also means a revolution in apprenticeships, so that just as those going on to university have got a great goal to aim for, which gets them up in the morning, gets their parents motivated, gets their teachers aligned with their objectives for life, which is getting them places in universities. For the 50% not going on to university, we need a similar through train, similarly high aspiration, a similar magnet effect for the students and the parents, and that I think has to be, as it is on a good part of continental Europe, high quality apprenticeships. Get those 4 things right, and we'll have a decent education system in this country.
Can I ask you, if you could have your time in government again, what is the one thing that you would do differently, or what you or reprioritise?
I would have got going on all these big reforms a lot sooner. It would have been a lot bolder. Matthew thinks I was a Trotskyite. I think I was incredibly timid. I made far too many compromises with those people who were opposed to reform. We spent far too long getting going on academies. We didn't scale up Teach First nearly fast enough. We spent far too much of the first term faffing around, not wanting to offend a lot of my colleagues in my own party by taking on really systematic reform of the comprehensive school, which was long overdue. We'd basically been failing generations of children in this country. We had to stop, and we spent too long turning this supertanker around. But having said all of that, that's easy to say in retrospect. It was all pretty tough at the time, and I'm not sure I would have survived an attempt to turn this supertanker around even faster.
Now, we can talk further about the pace of reform in a minute. Jane Keeley.
I don't think that education is in crisis. I think there's lots still to be done. The continued improvement of teaching quality. And I think that's both, and I'm saying teaching quality, agreeing that it's teachers that make the big difference, and it's also what they do. So I think that there are things that need to be done about how teaching is done by the present workforce, and also to continually improve, if you like, the DNA of that teaching workforce. I think the second thing that certainly needs to change is what you described, Andrew, as the curriculum and assessment, and I would describe as the whole curriculum and qualifications framework. We have a small sixth form at Haggerston. It only opened, this is its third year, and the first students went to university this term who had been there for 2 years. We've currently got students in year 13, the year that are applying to go to university, who even last year would without doubt have applied to go to university, but the prospect of £30,000 or something like that in tuition fees is actually deterring them. So we know about the places that are left unfilled in Russell Group universities and many other recruiting universities, not the selecting universities, in the UK this year. And it is, I think, a very serious problem for us that we've created this difficulty, this bottleneck, if you like. So actually, I'm linking that with thinking about the qualifications framework, because that works its way down. What happens to young people in terms of thinking about whether they want to do degrees will also influence, of course, what choices they make to study post-16. And certainly to come back to your point about there being sufficient choice of future for young people, whether they're going to leave at 16 this year, obviously the last year that they can do that, without going into further employment or educational training, but actually thinking about what choices there are for them, and then that impacting significantly on the choices that they're making before 16 as to whether there's going to be an EBAC, which is going to be something which will increasingly determine the choices that young people make. So far in the school of which I'm head, it hasn't had a huge impact. And the impact in terms of choice matters a great deal, because it's diverting potentially young people away from courses which they might otherwise be better suited to. The notion of something having a premium but for which they haven't really got access is something which we should seriously consider. And linked in with all of that, of course, is the whole area of assessment, again, as you had originally termed it, the idea about how valid and robust are the ways in which we measure children and measure their progress, but it actually feels to them quite often as if we're measuring them, of course. So I think that those would certainly be two things that we should tackle. And I think probably I've linked in there a tilt at higher education as well, and the politics of how it's paid for. So.
Jane, can I ask you, it's slightly changing the subject, but I was really intrigued to see this week that it looks as though, since schools were given responsibility for careers advice, that the spending on careers has gone catastrophically down, or down by a long way. And there is an argument that schools should never have been given responsibility for this, because schools have a producer interest in leading their pupils to stay in their sixth forms rather than necessarily doing other things and taking other routes, like, for example, high-quality apprenticeships. What's your interpretation of that? Is it a kind of just a teething issue, and then soon schools will invest in this, or were those who were worried about what schools would do when they were given autonomy, they were given this freedom, were they right?
Well, I suppose I think it's a little bit of both and. I certainly think that the model of giving head teachers and their governors, however that governance is ordained, is a good thing. Give the resources and then teachers can commission. Actually, speaking personally, it's much better that I've been able to commission and can hold accountable a system which I've commissioned. So if, for example, I'm going to employ somebody to give that independent advice and guidance to across the school for however many days a week, but I can determine what it is that I want, that's actually a different kind of relationship to the partnership relationship that would previously have existed with Connections, for example. So it's very, very different. However, the point that you're making is everybody going to do it? And is there going to be consistency? Is there going to be equality? Is every young person going to get that? I think part of it, obviously, is making regulations, saying it's law, you've got to do it. But I think also we need there isn't at the moment, if you like, an inspection process that we're familiar with about how that will be audited, how that will be quality assured. So I think there's a lot of potential. I certainly think the way to do it is to allow schools to commission it, because that allows for the not having a one-size-fits-all.
There was new research today which said that actually the English school system is 6th in the world, and actually the only thing it's not good at is the PISA tests, which is the way in which we kind of determine whether or not we're any good. Brett, you work internationally. There are Teach First being spawned all over the place. You've been involved in helping to establish it in other places. Is our kind of, breast beating, where everything's falling apart, we're falling behind everywhere else, is that unique to us, or everywhere you go in the world do people say, oh no, we're falling behind, it's terrible?
So there's about 24 countries now that have Teach First partner programs, and I would say every country I've been to, and I've met with many ministers of education, they always say the same thing, which is, first of all, our country is very special. Unlike England or America, others, top graduates will never teach in this country. That's the first thing. And usually then they end up being wrong. The second thing they say is, we're hugely concerned because of some droppage in the PISA, or because we weren't as high as we thought in PISA. And it feels like Andreas Schleicher's PISA is like everyone's boogeyman all over the world. My own view is on two things. One, I think there's no question, at least anecdotally, and it seems on the evidence, over the last 10 years there's been improvements. And I think people who say, the education system has gotten worse over the last 10 years, I think there's just no evidence that that's true. I think internationally, when I talk to people around the world, where people are jealous of the British system, people who are really interested in education reform, they're really jealous of the fact that, first of all, we have a nice unitary system where it's easy to make national change, and most national systems, I think, are much more federal. The fact that head teachers have enormous responsibility and autonomy in Britain, in England, much more than just about any system in the world. So, a head teacher can be a real school leader here, which enables much quicker change to happen in a school than in most countries. I think there is something about some sort of national, whether it's Ofsted or national exams, and you could argue whether everything's all perfect in there, but I think there is something about some national accountability, which doesn't always happen in many systems, which means it's a lot difficult for bad schools to hide, much more difficult now than it used to be. So these are all things which I think many countries are quite jealous of the British system. On the other hand, there's still a huge percentage of children who don't even get 5 C's at GCSE, which is a level of academic achievement that some states have shown 90% of kids should be able to achieve based on their brain development and everything. Says the system isn't where it needs to be, even at a minimum level, let alone to really push everyone to the level they need to be to compete with all the new economies that are growing around the world.
To what extent do you think that the coalition's current agenda, EBACS, academies, free schools, how relevant is that to that central task, do you think? So I sense a consensus about what the issue is, and then I see a set of government reforms, and there seems to me to be a slight disconnect. How does it feel to you?
It feels that those factors have impact. They do. It does make a difference. So legislation, for example, about how teachers will be appraised, how they'll be remunerated, all of those things have impact. They impact at the individual level as to individual teachers' decisions to stay in teaching, for example. In the end, it is what happens in teaching and learning, is what happens in the 25 hours that children have statutorily in the classroom. And of course, it's lots of time outside that. But the crucial minimum, that's really where we have to be looking at where we can make the biggest difference. Now, there's also then the impact of all those other external factors, like what are we teaching to, and all those questions about are we teaching to assessment, we're talking about league tables, we're talking about the ways in which schools have got to be measured, and it's a real dilemma, isn't it? Because as a citizen, we want our public institutions to be accountable, we want to know that they're delivering what they ought to be delivering, but at the same time, it tends to corrupt a lot of what can happen in schools, because you lose sight of what if you like, those things that bring most people into teaching, the passion, the engagement with children and young people, and watching them learn.
You've been a brilliant audience. Thank you so much for coming tonight. We've enjoyed working with Teach First. Can I ask you to thank Jane and Brett and Andrew?